Good afternoon, Easton, and welcome to the Rabbi's Roundtable. I'm Rabbi Peter Hyman, Rabbi at Temple B'nai Israel, and we are glad to have you for this very interesting and special edition of the Rabbi's Roundtable. Why is it special? Because I'm sitting with my friend and really interesting and engaging individual, Dr. Don Saff. And first let me say welcome to the Rabbi's Roundtable.
Glad to be here.
Yeah, I'm glad to have you. As some of you may know Don, but just in case there are those who don't, Don is a professor, he's an author, he's an art historian, and he is, you ready for this? An horologist. Now, what does the word horologist mean? Somebody who's interested in time. And how do I know this? Because my father was, among other things, a collector of clocks and a watch and clock repairer. He went on to do other things, but as I've always said, Don, one of the great regrets is that he died before I moved here, and you guys didn't have a chance to meet, because one of the things that I want to talk about with you is the really unusual clock that you have, and just so everybody knows, because of this clock, which we will talk about in a moment, you're in the Guinness Book of Records.
That's correct.
And why are you in the Guinness Book of Records?
Because the clock that I completed produced an accuracy of 5/8 of a second in a 100-day trial.
Wow.
So it did not deviate more than that. And
Wow.
for a pendulum clock operating in normal atmosphere, as opposed to working in a tank where
Right.
the atmosphere is reduced, it performed to that degree of accuracy and basically confirmed a proposition that was set forth in the 1750s by the great clockmaker John Harrison.
Well, to me this is very exciting, having grown up with mainsprings and pendulums and weights and chains all over the house and in the repair shop and all that. Tell me something. How did you acquire this clock? And then we'll talk about where it is now and why it's there and all that.
Well, I had found a clock that was in disrepair in New York, and did not know who made the clock. There was a name at the base, but I was not familiar with the maker. I had that clock repaired and restored and put into working condition. While at MIT giving a lecture, the curator at Harvard came over for a visit, asked me what I was working on, and I told him I was working on a clock by Martin Burgess. And he said, my goodness, I apprenticed with him. He said, you have to tell him about this. Well, I subsequently sent pictures to Burgess, but I also read an article by Burgess, which was given at the Longitude Symposium at Harvard in 1982. And the title of that was The Scandalous Neglect of John Harrison's Science. And once I read that, I realized that there was a group of people from the 1960s on who tried to understand what Harrison was writing in the 1750s.
Right.
And that Martin Burgess began to build two clocks that would demonstrate Harrison's science with modern technology.
Wow.
There's not a replica,
Yep.
but following the science. He finished one, the other was incomplete. And so I thought, my goodness, we have to finish this and put it on trial and see whether Harrison was correct, because his proposition was never proven or disproven.
Right.
And so that's how I came about acquiring this clock.
Just for the audience, Harrison's proposition, would you explain a little
Well,
bit about that?
Of course, it all comes down to the issue of longitude.
Right.
Navigating, for millennia has been, or was, you could tell latitude easily by the stars.
Right.
And for seafaring people, you would find a latitude, go to that latitude, and then go directly east or west.
Right.
That didn't work out a lot of the times, especially since pirates would know exactly what latitude you'd be at,
Right.
and they would be lying in wait for you. But also, there was an issue of, how can you navigate relative to longitude? You could by observing the moon and by observing certain stars. That required the sky to be clear, and you could have cloudy skies for days, weeks, and that made navigating rather difficult.
Yep.
In the early 1700s, there was a very serious sea catastrophe off southern England, in which thousands of sailors were killed by inaccurate longitude.
Yeah.
And so in 1702, there was an Act of Queen Anne which offered £20,000 for great accuracy in navigation. John Harrison eventually won that. It was very difficult because he, basically starting out as a carpenter, although he was very knowledgeable about music, but as an uneducated man, he began to make very accurate clocks and suggested that the best way to find longitude is by time. And he set out proving that. It was a long haul, and of course he produced a clock eventually that held to the principles set forth in the Act of Queen Anne,
Yep.
and he was awarded the £20,000,
Which was a lot of money.
which was a fortune at that time. But it was always uphill because the scientists, including Newton and the astronomer royals, all felt that any navigation should be done by stars or lunar projections. That you approach things scientifically and mathematically. The problem is you can do that if you have clear skies and if you're extremely capable in mathematics, and it takes a long time to determine that. Whereas all you have to do is have an accurate clock,
That's correct.
set it to Greenwich Mean Time, go traveling, find when the sun is up, midday, compare it to the clock, and you know exactly where you are on longitude. And as I said before, latitude would be determined by the stars.
Right. Well, then there's that great book, Longitude.
By Davis Sobel, right?
Yes.
And that was based on this symposium at Harvard
Right.
that Martin Burgess gave a lecture,
Yep.
and that was what I read and
Yeah.
brought me to Burgess's clock.
Well, and I would recommend that if anybody finds this interesting. It's a great book. You told me I read it. It's wonderful. So tell me, where is the clock now?
So when I acquired the clock, I had to put a team together to analyze the direction which we should go and how the clock should be finished, consonant with Harrison's principles. Now, the biggest problem with Harrison and why he wasn't taken seriously towards the end of his career relative to a wall regulator. The others were sea clocks, relative to a wall regulator. And the fact that he stated that he could produce a clock that was accurate within a second in 100 days. It was an unheard of concept. His writing was very opaque and very convoluted, very difficult to understand. And frankly, I mean, people thought he was, as accomplished as he was, thought he was quite crazy because of his lack of skill, I guess, in making clear his thoughts.
Yeah.
But reading that, we knew that there had to be a way forward following his principles. A group of people started in the 60s called the Harrison Research Group, and part of that group was Martin Burgess. I gathered those people together, those who were still alive, to direct the completion of the clock. I engaged Frodshams, which is a very prestigious clock firm that's 100 plus years in England, and they completed it under my direction. When they were finishing the clock, they started timing it and realized that it was going to be every bit what Harrison said.
Amazing.
And so the people at the Royal Observatory said, we're willing to put it on official trial. And with that, the clock was set up at the Royal Observatory at the base of the great refractor, the great equatorial telescope, and the trials began. The case was sealed, not hermetically sealed,
Right.
atmospherically, but sealed so it couldn't be tampered with.
Yeah.
It was sealed by the head of the National Physics Laboratory and the director of the Worshipful Clockmakers Company, so that nothing could be altered. The clock was basically left alone for the 100-day trial, and it was accurate within 5/8 of a second in 100 days,
phenomenal.
way beyond what. And actually, long term, it is better than most clocks that were in tanks with atmospheric control, and even clocks which had crystal regulation.
Yeah.
And that was subject to thermal drift, whereas this was not. So with that, the clock we just let it run, and the decision was to put the clock in the longitude gallery next to the Harrison C clocks,
How cool.
which was a great honor for Burgess, who is in his 80s and was basically a forgotten soul.
Yeah.
And his accomplishment was acknowledged by placing the clock there. And most importantly, John Harrison's statements were vindicated 250 years later by the performance of this clock. Now, Harrison was a remarkable man in that he basically invented the cage roller bearing. He invented roller bearings. And he invented the bimetallic strip for thermal
Yeah, sure.
change.
Yeah.
So the bimetallic strip is in every thermostat in everybody's house.
Yep.
It was invented by him as a way of compensating for temperature change in a clock.
I didn't know that.
And of course, the roller bearings, became part
Right.
of the automobile industry,
Sure, everything.
industry, everything. And, it goes on from there in terms of his theories and compensation. And even now, 250 years later, with the development of this clock, there is discussion that the aerospace industry, is interested in the phenomena of this pendulum, its flotation, how slippery it is in air, as it applies to aerodynamics.
Oh, sure.
And so the story goes on. And all of this was based on Burgess's lecture, The Scandalous Neglect of John Harrison's Work. And when I read that, I realized it's not just the scandalous neglect of John Harrison's work, it is the scandalous neglect of Martin Burgess's work, who set out
Right.
to prove that,
Yeah.
and it would have been forgotten were it not for reading a brilliant lecture
Yeah,
that he
yeah.
gave at Harvard.
So how did you get interested in collecting clocks to be in the first place?
How did I get interested in collecting
Yeah.
clocks?
I mean, what about? I know why. I mean, my affinity is because I grew up with them, and as I said, the mainsprings and hairsprings and pendulums and
Well, to go back to the very beginning,
Yeah.
my grandfather had a beautiful Omega pocket watch, and we'd sit on his lap, and I'd see him take out the watch and look at it. That watch went to my father, who then, instead of giving it to me or to my older brother, gave it to my younger brother when he went off to teach at Georgia Tech at age 16. And so since then, I have been collecting watches and clocks, all in compensation
Yeah.
for this. But fundamentally, what appeals to me is the elegance
Yes.
of these inanimate objects that become animate.
Absolutely.
They have a beat, not dissimilar to a heartbeat. And one listens to it like one listens to a heart. It follows the pulsing of your own blood through your veins. It's extraordinary, aesthetically beautiful
The words right out of my mouth.
objects. And
What?
so it funded naturally into my my artistic interest, as well as my mechanical
Sure.
interest as a person who started off in engineering and who then was seduced and digressed into art history by, by some great artists.
Sure. No, my father always said, aside like you, not only did the mechanics, the engineering of a movement fascinate him, but he always recognized, and he used to say, there is an aesthetic in the movement itself, in the totality of the movement, how it interacts, how the parts move together, how they fit and how they work, and yes, so I understand that beautifully, wonderfully, and clearly.
And to see how some of these thinkers, these horologists and scientists, Harrison rang bells at a church and realized, the effect of the amplitude of a bell,
Yeah.
and where you input the power and so forth. He translated that into clockmaking, into the behavior of a pendulum. And he realized also that any clock is subject to friction, and that friction is, the problem with friction is exacerbated by oil, which changes viscosity or gathers dust. And so he set out to produce a clock that requires no oil. And so for the bearings of the arbors, the axles that run in the bearings, he used lignum vitae for the bearing. Lignum vitae is a wood that has a natural oil. You could run something in that for hundreds of years, and the natural oil will keep it going without adding any oil that will attract any dust. And then to reduce friction, the bearings, the roller bearings that I talked about before, and he produced an escapement, the escapement being the part of a clock or a watch that makes time incremental. In other words, it breaks down time into specific periods. And the escapement that he created was for the first time an escapement that had no friction. And so the combination of all of that funds into the possibility of making an extremely accurate clock. So he could balance all these physical phenomena that would compensate for barometric change, for temperature change, which makes the pendulum grow longer. It grows longer, the clock moves slower, or it gets shorter, the clock moves faster. He compensated with steel rods and brass rods operating against one another to have a net change of zero. I mean, it goes on and on in terms of the brilliance of this and the implications for industry generally.
It's phenomenal, and you're right. The circles from the center are pretty endless, actually, and it's fascinating that NASA is interested. And the clock now is at the Time Longitude Gallery at the Greenwich Observatory in England.
Correct.
And if anybody wants to go see it, they're welcome to go see it. It's on display, and this, I just find this fascinating. And you got invited to be in the Guinness Book of Records because it's your clock, basically.
It's my clock. I finished it, and they set up the rules for testing it, and found that it is the most accurate pendulum clock operating free air in existence.
Well, I think the story is fascinating. I'm proud of you. I'm happy for you. Next time I visit my relatives in London, definitely on the list of places to go. I thank you for sharing all of this. I think, as I said, I find it fascinating, interesting, and actually important. And the lesson, there are a number of takeaways for me. But, sometimes we should look at the ancients, because I have a rule, when I teach Bible and text, I always say ancient ain't stupid. And here's an example of this exactly. 250 years ago, a very insightful but not particularly understood individual came forth with all this, and we ignored it for a long time.
Right, ignored it. And unfortunately, ignoring it put celestial observation behind 250 years. They could have used it, but instead they went with the science from a credible maker by the name of George Graham, who used what they call a deadbeat escapement. They used mercury for compensation of pendulum. And all of that is contrary to the most effective way of doing it. And England and the rest of the world would have been ahead 250 years in terms of accuracy. And it was needed because an accurate clock would continue functioning irrespective of weather or cloud cover, so you knew, the appropriate time without compromise. And it took all these years to prove Harrison correct.
Well, good for you. We are, as I said, we're proud of you and happy for you. And we are delighted that you came to the Rabbis Roundtable. We'll come again. You'll come again.
Absolutely,
and we'll talk.
my pleasure.
Thank you, Don.
Thank you for inviting me.
Oh, my pleasure. We will be back, Easton.
It's different than any place I've ever been. It's easy to just be in the room with everybody else and enjoying the show together.
I'm very impressed. Just the variety, the quality, the intimacy.
And we are back, and welcome back to the Rabbis Roundtable. I'm Rabbi Peter Hyman, and we are seated now with a individual, a lovely person, not unfamiliar to many of us in this city, Amy Haines. And many of you know that Amy is the proprietor and restaurateur exceptional of Out of the Fire. And thank you for being here.
Thank you for asking me.
No, I'm excited. And we're going to talk about a couple of things about an Aspen Institute program and the Dock Street Foundation and a program that I think is important coming up. And so thank you for being at the Rabbis Roundtable.
Thank you.
Let's start off. Tell me a little bit about the Aspen Institute. What is it? How did it
So the
get to us?
the Aspen Institute is, I think, was formed around 67 years ago, and it was to engage people in important conversations about culture, politics, religion, etc. And about, I want to say 10 to 12 years ago, they started the Aspen Y Fellows, which is part of the Y property in Y Mills, and that's a 1,000-acre campus, and that's for intellectually curious participants on the Eastern Shore.
Yep.
And it's a wonderful program. We have had ambassadors from various countries. Ruth Bader Ginsburg is coming. Nancy Cordes from CBS is coming in the next calendar program. And local, we have Ed Gabriel, who's a former ambassador to Morocco. We had Al Sykes, who was a former head of the FCC.
Right.
The interesting, they did a program with Al and Tom Wheeler, who's a current head of the FCC. But they have, Richard and I just attended a program there. It's been within the year. It was on revenge and forgiveness, which was a really interesting program. There were 18 of us that had engaged in a 2-day seminar on the Y campus.
Oh, how wonderful.
And
I didn't know about that.
yeah, it was really powerful. And
sure. Who led it? Do you remember?
so I can't remember I'm sorry.
That's okay.
Forgive me. I can't remember the moderators, but there was a rabbi from Arlington.
Oh, really?
That was a survivor of the Holocaust, and he had a very powerful story to share.
Sure.
And a gentleman that was involved in the Truth and Reconciliation process in South Africa,
South Africa.
a woman from South Carolina who was a member of the church that was involved with those horrific shootings.
Oh, wow.
And Mary Emanuel, I believe, is the name of the church.
I think
it's in Charleston. Mother Emanuel. Yeah, excuse me, Mother Emanuel. And that's kind of an example of programs that they provide up there. And it's you also, by being a Y Fellow, which is you join, it's a yearly membership, you also have access to the programs that they have in Washington, D.C., so book talks and really, it's very significant, and it's very.
Actually. How does one become a member if one wants to be a member?
So you can get on the Aspen Institute website or call the campus here in the Y campus and talk to Judy Price, And I believe right now the membership is $1,200 a year, and it goes up to $1,500 in January. So, but it's definitely worth joining.
Absolutely. And along with the Aspen Institute, tell us a little bit about the Dock Street Foundation.
So the Dock Street Foundation is a private foundation, and we support programs in Talbot County and also abroad, but that enhance health, culture, education, and we like the programs that help bring the community together, like the Rooster Rose exhibit,
which was phenomenal.
That was
It really was.
Yeah.
You did a wonderful service to the community straight across the board, and you to be commended. So thank you for that.
Well, I have to give Richard,
Yes.
excuse me, the credit for that and the team he built around
Yeah,
the Rooster Rose exhibit. I can't take credit for that.
Well, can we just?
I was spiritually involved.
Can we just tell people who Richard is?
Richard is my husband. Richard Marks is my husband.
Yes, wonderful.
So there's nepotism in the Dock Street Foundation.
It's okay. It's okay. And the Aspen Institute and the Dock Street Foundation have teamed up to bring us a really interesting program with somebody whose name may be familiar to many of our watchers, Krista Tippett.
Yes.
And I know you've met her.
Yes, I have.
So tell
Yeah.
us.
So I actually have been listening to Krista since 2002, and I think that was around the time that she started Speaking of Faith.
Yes.
And so I used to wake up every Sunday morning. I would set my alarm to wake up to her program.
Yep.
And people ask me to describe her and her program, and I say, it's like being a voyeur in somebody's living room and listening to two highly enlightened and thoughtful people having a conversation.
Yes.
And she's asking some important questions about who we are, how we are in the world, and you have this. I don't know. It's a very intimate program.
I would agree. I would listen to her also, and what I appreciated from my perspective as a clergy person, and she always, in some way, would get to the core of the question of the nature of faith and how that particular person with whom she was in dialogue influenced that question and understood that question. And again, from my perspective, a very important, real issue to deal with. As I go out and do, or as we, meaning my colleagues and I, go out and deal with that, the nature of faith, its impact, its presence in our lives. So I'm excited.
How it forms us, how it shapes us, and I think that's one of the first questions she asks her guests, if there was a religious influence or spiritual influence in their upbringing. And I think that one thing that she asks from her audience, which I think is so key in how we relate to each other, is open-mindedness. Because I think I was telling you earlier that I remember waking up one morning and she introduced the guests of her show, and it was, I don't want to get into the topic, but it was
somebody controversial,
somebody that I thought there is no way I can relate to this person, and I'm like, and I really, Krista, and I thought, okay, I have to trust her. I mean, I have to remain open during this hour, and I arrived at the conclusion and arrived at, I understand why this person is so tightly wrapped around this subject. She did a project called Conversations with Civility.
Yes.
And the first, I think one of the first show, the inaugural show for this was, she had the woman that was head of the pro-choice movement, and forgive me, I can't remember her name. And there was a gentleman who was head of the pro-life movement. And so she said, look, there are words we use in our culture that are very charged, and they divide us, they fractionate us. And she said, and I think it's very important, if you're going to be involved in this project, this conversation, that we leave those words on the table. We don't use words, that murder, abortion, things that can be And so, it was an interview that could have been highly inflammatory.
Yeah.
And her guests were, mindful enough around the fact that this keeps separating us, these words that we choose to use in our language, in our conversation, create a divide.
Absolutely.
And, things are, media, technology, things like that are fueling it. And it wasn't, she's just very thoughtful about how she approaches subjects.
I'm excited about her. Why is she coming, by the way?
So Aspen has a speaker series.
Yes.
What's
the event?
And a couple years ago, I said to Richard, you all need to get Krista Tippett here. I mean, she would be fabulous, and she fits right in with the mission of intellectual curiosity and enlightened conversation, and so he reached out to NPR to try to make contact with her. A friend of ours, I don't know if you know Antoine Van Akmel, who is on the board of NPR. And she's actually American Public. That's through American Public Media.
Yep.
So anyway, long story short, Richard finally ends up connecting with one of her producers, and says we'd like to do a program, through the Aspen Institute with you, and as a birthday present, my 50th birthday present, I think it was, he arranged for me to go out to Minneapolis and sit in on a private taping with her.
He's such a good guy, your husband.
And we listened to the Irish poet Paul Muldoon be interviewed by Krista, and spent 2 days in her studio, which is beautiful. And she is as beautiful in person as she is on the air. And she's humble, she's mindful, she's thoughtful, she's gracious.
She is what she is.
Yeah. So and then that started the dialogue about bringing them here. And one of her producers, named Lily Percy, said, we've been wanting to interview Anil Dash. And we thought, okay, if this is something that you all feel strongly about, then it's probably worth pursuing.
Yes.
And he's in New York.
Yep.
He's was a consultant. Actually, he's a technology entrepreneur. He was a high-tech consultant, and his I don't know if it's, and forgive me because I'm not as technologically astute, but I think it's his Twitter account is one of the most followed Twitter accounts. He talks about technology and how it's shaping culture, media, government.
He does.
And so that it'll be interesting.
When is the program?
It's November 17th.
November 17th?
At the Avalon.
Right here, right upstairs?
Right upstairs.
And open to the public?
Open to the public.
Very cool. Is there
there's a
admission
ticket
charge?
There's a ticket price is $15, I believe, and if you want a personalized signed copy of her new book Becoming Wise, I think it's $35.
Mm-hmm.
And there's also a program at the Aspen Institute, and that is actually for the Y Fellows.
If you're interested, it's online. You can just Google the Avalon Theater. It's on there.
It's on, it should be, and it's on DocStreetFoundation.com.
DocStreetFoundation.com, and also
and the Aspen Institute.
Yep. This is very exciting. First of all, this is she is, as we have just said, well known, well respected, an effective interviewer as well as an effective individual. And Anil Dash is also pretty well known to people who follow this stuff. This is wonderful. This is the kind of stuff that makes me just adore this community.
Right.
What we do and how. Not
We're lucky.
We, but beyond lucky.
We're really
but it's
lucky
not just
to live
about
here.
luck.
Right.
You and Richard have a very high horizon, and there are lots of people like that around here who not only make things happen but appreciate the consequence of this kind of programming. So to the Aspen Institute, to Dock Street Foundation, to you and Richard, we really say thank you for making this happen. Anything else that the viewers should know about this before we conclude this session of the Rabbis Roundtable, which I think has been a wonderful session, by the way. What do I know?
I think that everybody needs to buy their tickets.
Yes, that's for sure. Everybody buy their tickets, fill the house,
Right.
and take advantage of what is being, this gift that's being given to us.
Definitely.
So to Richard, tell him I send my regards and
I
my
will do
thank
that.
you.
Thank
And,
you.
and we will see you on the 17th. And this brings us to the conclusion of yet another Rabbi's Roundtable. I'm glad you were able to join us, and we look forward to seeing you at the 17th and at subsequent Rabbi's Roundtables. Goodbye for now, Easton. We're out.